An audio learning object is exactly what it sounds like. A digital audio file designed to deliver meaningful content to a learner audience. In this presentation, I'd like to introduce you to three broad categories of audio learning objects that cover a variety of instructional design contexts, and then we're going to nerd out a little bit and review some of the production technologies and workflows that multimedia developers have to use to actually produce them. But let's begin with instructional design. As developers, we often need to create specific audio assets for multimedia learning objects. These can be as simple as a sound effect, such as a bell dinging when a learner clicks a correct answer, or it could be room tone, which is the ambient background noise that establishes setting or place in a digital story. It could be a looping music soundtrack that plays underneath other audio. It could be dialogue, edited from an expert interview, for example, or it could be just the instructor's narration. The key distinction in this category is that the audio asset eventually gets embedded in a more comprehensive learning object, and it's not necessarily standalone, similar to the distinction between a simple instructional graphic and a printed learning aid. Podcasts, on the other hand, are designed for individual learner consumption directly. The learner either downloads it manually to their device, or it's delivered automatically to a dedicated player app. We'll learn more about the distribution voodoo later in this presentation, but for now, just think of podcasts as audio files that play back instructional lectures or stories about specific learning content. Podcasts are also used a lot in language instruction, where proper diction and pronunciation have to be modeled by the instructor. For young learners, podcasts that play back an instructional song can be very popular. And of course, an interview and dialogue podcasts enable learners to hear content experts interact on specific topics. So there are a lot of different ways that podcasts can be utilized in the instructional context. Now, the key commonality that these instructional design applications share is the delivery format. It's an audio file, usually an MP3. Now, having said that, I have to acknowledge that sometimes you're going to hear people suggest that a podcast can also include video. For example, there are some that would call this presentation that we're watching right now a podcast. And there are even others who would say, no, it's not a podcast, it's a vodcast. Get it? Video, podcast, vodcast. But don't get confused. Let's keep this really, really simple. Our operational definition of a podcast will merely be an audio file that delivers instructional content, whatever that is. There's no doubt podcasting has kind of this citizen journalism appeal, very similar to blogging. If you have a microphone and an opinion, you can call yourself a podcaster. You can even make a living doing it. But for our needs, podcasting is about getting learners to listen to well-produced audio files or on various instructional topics. So those are the two categories of instructor-generated audio learning objects. Let's switch now to student-produced projects, because this is where a lot of the research has been focused for several years. Can student audio projects validly and reliably indicate their mastery of targeted instructional content? The answer so far is a tentative yes, especially when built around the following framework. Student audio projects can be developed, for example, as reports, where they review works that they're studying currently, or they summarize, for example, a book that they've been reading, or they write, in other words, they record via scripting essays or biographies of historical or relevant characters in whatever their content discipline is. Or homework protocols. They record themselves doing actual homework. Sometimes we call these worked samples, where they're actually speaking out as they answer math problems, for example, or as they work with certain language exercises. In storytelling projects very popular, especially dramatic readings where they recreate some work that they're particularly reading, or maybe they rewrite an ending and they retell the story. Advertising, of course, is a very popular one, creating a radio ad or a public service announcement that formalizes whatever their opinions are about a particular topic. Have you ever heard of a cut-up? A cut-up is, you've seen these many times, especially in TV, especially during election periods where you watch typically the adversarial opponents taking bits and pieces of authentic interviews of candidates and splicing them together to make the candidate sound like they're saying something that is taken completely out of context, sometimes even at a word-by-word level. If you've ever watch some of the productions by Jib Jab, for example. They can be very funny, but they tell complete stories that sometimes will just take a single word and splice it together from 10 different interviews to make a sentence that makes absolutely no sense compared to what the original context was. But anyway, these are called cut-ups, and they're a very fun and engaging way for students to use authentic footage and make something new. Not always accurate, but it's definitely a fun exercise. Sound stories. Typically, these are stories where you start often with a visual prompt, a photo, a video, etc., and you challenge students to use sounds only to tell some kind of story. And so they have to create an audio composition that tells the story that's being visualized in whatever the probe is. Dialogue, of course. Students create audio projects where they interview experts or they interview other subjects that are relevant to the content area, and then they splice those interviews together. Sometimes they're debates, and of course we've already talked about language exercises as well, where they're practicing using language in particular ways, especially foreign language. And of course, sometimes they're just creating audio assets that are to be used in other more comprehensive projects. Sometimes it's as simple as a soundtrack, or maybe they're recording singing, or maybe they're creating a ringtone that's relevant to whatever it is they're studying, or some type of sound effect or sound bite, narration of course, and dialogue of course between multiple characters. So all of these examples, reports, storytelling, dialogue, and assets, are common ways that student projects are involved with the audio composition process. So what does it take to produce high quality instructional audio? Well, you're going to need some hardware and software, you know that, but you're also going to need to know what file formats to use, as well as how to publish them to your learners. So in this section here, let's get a little specific. Let's start first with recording. What do you need to record great sound? It doesn't matter if it's just a quick soundbite or a multi-speaker podcast. You need to remember only one simple technical strategy. Don't use built-in mics. Learners have zero tolerance for poor quality audio, so your first challenge is to acquire an external mic. It sounds easy, but as you would suspect, there's a microphone for just about every possible application you can imagine. So make sure you pick the right one to match whatever it is that the instructional development need requires. For example, let's start with the simplest, a headset mic. Super inexpensive, and for many instructional needs, this is going to allow us to do everything that we need to do. The good part about using a headset instead of just a standard microphone is that you can actually hear yourself or hear the other content that's being played while you're recording. Of course, you know what a handheld microphone is, and obviously the advantage here is portability. A lavalier microphone, typically we use these for camera-based or video-based productions, especially where the microphone, it's important that the microphone is positioned in a stealthy location, typically on their shirt, out of view, or at least so it's not as distracting on camera. A studio microphone, absolutely essential for professional sounding podcast audio where you don't need to move around much. You're recording at your desktop or your laptop, and you want a high quality omnidirectional microphone or directional microphone. Most of these can do both, which can be very, very practical for you if you have guests in the studio one day, or if you just want to record yourself. It has this particular microphone here, for example, the Blue Yeti, has a knob that you simply turn. If you need omnidirectional, you turn it to one setting. If you need it to be directional, pointing just at you, then you turn it to another setting. And the quality of the audio is significant. A shotgun microphone. This is a highly sensitive directional microphone. You see this a lot at sporting events where the shotgun is actually pointed right at whatever the activity is so that it can hit the helmets clashing together or hear the basketball going in through the hoop, etc. during a free throw. These are shotgun mics, and they're very, very specific. Sometimes you'll see them mounted on a camera, especially a DSLR camera when you're doing an interview, and especially if the subject is moving, because a lavalier microphone doesn't work very well there because it catches the clothing sound rubbing up against the lavalier because it's pinned to the shirt. So a shotgun mic is a better option at that point. And of course, no matter what microphone you choose, you're going to need a mixer. at some point if you ever want to use more than one speaker. If you're just recording your own voice and you have no need for two speakers simultaneously, in other words a dialogue or an interview, then a mixer is not needed. But if you ever want to have multiple people speaking at the same time in a dialogue or conversational format, you're going to need a mixer and multiple mics, and these can be very, very cheap. Obviously, you'll also need headphones because you want to be able to monitor the quality of the sound. Typically, before you actually start recording, you want to do a couple tests. And earbuds, you know what those are. A headset we've already talked about. Studio microphones tend to be a little bit more expensive, but the advantage here is that it can weed out any ambient noise that's in the room where you're recording. And you know this, you've used these many times before, but that's one of the reasons that you'll see sportscasters wear these particular headphones during an event, so they don't have to listen to all the crowd noise behind them. They can actually hear each other much better. So the point here is simply choose the headphone set that makes the most sense for whatever your particular recording need is. You'll also need a workstation where you want to do your recording, and that could be a complex desktop, although most of us tend to have laptops these days. There are mobile options as well. iPads and iPhones, for example, have lots of apps that support high-quality audio recording in the field, and there are plenty of adapters. Same with Android. Obviously, you're going to need some recording software, and there are plenty of options there. On the Windows format, Audacity is an extremely popular application, as is Camtasia now. Camtasia started out as this screen capture software, but it's also an outstanding audio editor. And of course, in the Creative Cloud series by Adobe, Audition is their flagship audio editing platform. For Mac, of course, you have GarageBand, which is also a mobile app. And there's also a Mac version of Audacity, Camtasia as well, and Audition as well. On the mobile web environment, in addition to GarageBand, you also have some really popular apps like Spreaker, Cast, and BossJock Studio. There are plenty of others, but those are three that you tend to see utilized a lot by the professionals. Let's talk briefly about file formats, and I want to begin with this concept of a project file. A project file is the native file that's created when you use an audio editor. Audacity has its own project file format with a .aup extension. GarageBand has its own project file format. Audition has its own project file format. The point is, and it's really important that you understand this, just like with video, when you're creating a composition of a variety of different elements and you hit the save button, the native file format is only playable on that software platform. And that's appropriate for when you're still building or when you're still composing or when you're still editing. But at some point when it's finally finished, you have to export it in a standardized format. And we'll talk about that. That's a totally different file format from what I'm talking about right now. The project file is the work file, and it's not what you would disseminate to the public. So having said that, let's say we want to create an audio composition. One of the first options we have, other than recording our own files in real time, is to import other files. And most of these audio editors tend to focus around the following import audio formats. MP3, you know, of course, WAV, Windows audio file, and AIF, which is the Macintosh equivalent, are non-lossy, super high quality audio file formats. M4A and AAC are advanced formats, but they're also lossy. In other words, they're also a compressed audio file format. And there's the successor of MP3, but the adoption is not really significant yet outside the Apple universe, and that may change. And of course, Ogg Vorbis, that's kind of a strange sounding name, but this is a file format that's very common in the Linux operating system community. It's not something we use very often, but for those in that universe, it is a popular format. Now, the good news is no matter what you import into your audio editor, MP3 is still right now the preferred export audio file format. So there's significant agreement on what you export from your editor. That's great news. So no matter what we bring in, we can edit it, stitch it together, compose it whatever way we want. When we export, we only have to worry about exporting one kind of file, and that's an MP3. We do have a few decisions to make, like what bit rate do we need, and what sampling rate do we need? Bit rate has to do with how much data it plays per second. And roughly the preferred standard right now for most of our applications is 128 kilobits per second. And that equals to about a megabyte per minute of audio. And that's a general standard. You can certainly go higher, but to the audible audible professional, they might be able to detect some differences at higher bit rates. But for normal people, 128 will get you exactly what you need. So keep that in mind as a round number. Now, sampling is a little tricky to understand, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here about it, but let me explain this real quickly. We know, for example, that audio travels as a wave. Okay, anybody who's ever listened to a car drive by them understands that as it gets away from you, the frequency of the wave stretches out, and as it approaches, it gets shorter, so the sounds change. Okay, we all know that. But in the digital world, how do you approximate that? Well, you approximate it with numbers, and you can plot these numbers together. You see these columns here in this waveform? These columns are approximations. In other words, if we were to use math to plot out lines that would approximate the slope and amplitude of this wave, we could come pretty close to replicating what this wave does in real life by simply using numbers. And the great news there is that we've fine-tuned it to the point where we know that, for example, for our needs, the 44.1 kilohertz spectrum, which is default, works very, very well as a sampling rate. Obviously, if the columns were to get skinnier and skinnier and skinnier, we would continue to approximate the actual wave accuracy substantially. But we do so at the expense of additional file size. So 44.1 kilohertz is the default and preferred sampling rate in most of our audio editors, and that's another number to remember. Finally, let's talk about publishing. Okay, so you export your MP3. Now what do you do with it? Well, as an instructor, you've got a couple options. The simplest of which is probably just to stick it up on your cloud drive and link to it, or to put it in a learning management system. You could embed it in the learning management system using some HTML embed code, or simply use a hyperlink. That's the easiest way to do it. Now, obviously there are other options, and that's where we get into hosting services, especially podcast hosting services. You can think of podcast hosting services kind of like video hosting services such as YouTube. The advantage of a podcast hosting service is really simple syndication, RSS. This is a technology that uses metadata, which is just some data coding, that allows your particular podcast to be published to other players, anybody who has a player and subscribes to your particular podcast. So it's an automatic broadcasting service. It's and that's simply a simple way to think of syndication. iTunes absolutely dominates this particular facet of the industry, especially in education, but there are other options. There are plenty of other hosts. SoundCloud, Podbean, Podomatic, Libsyn, Blueberry, and Buzzsprout tend to be platforms that you hear about a lot. They all do the same thing. They publish, they actually host, they ingest the actual MP3 file, and then they generate this RSS feed code that other users can then use to subscribe to your podcast and download automatically to your player. Now, what's the advantage of hosting it at one of these services? Well, for instructional needs, it may not be quite as obvious because we're dealing with a very specific learner population, and in most cases we've tied it into our learning management system. But if you're trying to broadcast to the public, then a podcast hosting service is an absolute no-brainer because it has a very comprehensive set of analytics that come with those services so that you can learn more about who's using or listening to your podcast and who's subscribing to it, and you can make certain business decisions about what you need to do. It also has typically bundled with it social media services so that you can interact with your listeners. So podcast hosting services are a comprehensive package. For most of our needs, we typically can get away with the learning management system or the content management system that we're using, or simply just put it up on our cloud drive and link to it. So those are some of the design and production issues that multimedia developers have to address when building instructional materials. I hope that this information is useful to you. It's primarily a foundation for the future modules and tutorials where we actually get to produce something. We'll create an audio learning object for our specific teaching or training discipline, and that's going to be really, really fun. But as always, simply want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you online.